The turn of the century did not just see a change in how America interacted with the rest of the world, it also led to a dramatic change in policy at home. While America had had several reform movements take place since the Civil War, the rise of progressive ideas and theories dominated the first 2 decades of the 20th century. The time of laissez-faire had ended. Old philosophies about hands-off individualism seemed to be out of place in light of how the excesses of capitalism had harmed the working class. A new attitude that the people, through the government, could substitute for the conscience of corporations seemed to be afoot. The values of the progressive era were rooted in the decades that followed the Civil War. Looking back at our previous lecture, you can see these pro-reform movements in actions of the Greenback Party in the 1870s that sought to thwart the power of the robber barons by creating a policy that would repay Civil War veterans for their greenbacks in gold currency. The legacy of populism in the decade prior to the 20th century also helped shape the progressive era. While populists largely stemmed from the Midwest, agricultural regions, and rural areas, the populist values that reigned in the railroads encouraged a progressive income tax system and a more diverse currency rooted in bimetallism, the direct election of U.S. senators, and voter initiatives that would give a greater voice to the common person shaped the progressive movements of the first 2 decades of the 20th century. Just a side note, if you're not familiar with what a progressive income tax is, it's when the amount of money a person is charged on their income increases as a person's wealth increases. While populists were geared more towards the rural life and began in early agricultural movements like the Granger Society, these ideas also appeared to urban progressives who saw problems with political and corporate excesses in their regions as well. Also giving voice to the progressive era was a growing group of middle-class Americans who wanted to encourage greater amounts of economic and moral reform. This political movement was at the heart of the politics of intellectuals, women, the media, and working professionals. While the objectives of the progressive era varied widely and sometimes were contradictory, the major goals included 3 areas of reform: social, political, and economic reform. In this lecture, we will be discussing specific details about each of these 3 areas. Following the first decade of the 20th century, many Americans were starting to recognize that the glitter of the Gilded Age was not golden. Economic inequality, political corruption, and the blight of urban cities led many people to call for political reforms. Between 1880 and 1920, about 27 million immigrants entered the United States, mostly from impoverished areas in Eastern and Southeastern Europe. The cities also swelled with the ranks of rural Americans that came to the city looking for work and opportunity. Others were drawn there for the allure of entertainment, shopping, and the new technology, such as electricity and plumbing, that they would be able to find there. But at large, the city was festering with disease, vice, and misery, especially in the tenements. While decades before, the gospel of wealth would have indicated that people that lived in these conditions were in those places because they deserved it. A new attitude about the suffering of the poor was starting to develop thanks to progressive philosophy. Writers like Lester Frank Ward challenged the idea of the survival of the fittest. They argued that it was natural for people to control and change their social environment, and that the laws, customs, and relationships amongst people tended to be shaped for one's own benefit. It was the role of the government to help shape society and make it a better place for those that had no control over it themselves. Legislation should address things like inadequate housing and economic inequality. Social scientist Richard Ely proposed the counterpoint to the gospel of wealth, known as the social gospel movement. It promoted a brand of progressivism based on the ideas that people, especially Christians, should use their religious doctrine to demand better housing and living conditions for the urban poor. Churches changed their mission from saving souls to improving living conditions for those less fortunate living around them. Feeling it was their moral obligation, urban reformers went after slumlords. The causes of juvenile delinquency, such as a lack of education and child labor. They attacked the practice of vices, such as prostitution and alcoholism. And they looked to the government to provide public services such as clean water, electric lighting, and public transportation, as support for public ownership of utilities grew. In the same way that memes and blogs reach a wide range of audience today, magazines and periodicals such as McClure's, Cosmopolitan, Collier's, and Everybody's woke the public conscience up to what was going on in the inner city. They dug deep for dirt that the public would both love and respond emotionally to. It's for this reason that President Teddy Roosevelt called the journalists behind these articles muckrakers. However, fearing legal reprisals, muckraking magazines went to great lengths and an extreme expense to make sure that the information they were publishing was factual. Ida Tarbell's publication spent $3,000 to confirm that her expose on Standard Oil was indeed accurate. The Yellow Press played a very important role, especially the publications of Pulitzer and Hearst. This is a picture of Ida Tarbell. Tarbell was one of the most eminent women in the muckraking movement and one of the most respected business historians and journalists of her generation. In 1904, she earned a national reputation for publishing a scathing history of the Standard Oil Company and how it would destroy people's businesses, including her father's. 2 years later, she joined Ray Standard Baker, William Allen White, and other muckrakers in purchasing the American Magazine, which became a journalistic podium in their campaign for honest government reform and an end to business abuses. While even the president would get frustrated with muckraking journalists, especially when they went after fellow Republicans in Congress, muckrakers actually signified much about the nature of the progressive reform movement. They looked to address public issues through transparent journalism and the exercise of First Amendment rights, but they stopped short of revolutionary remedies. While much of Europe was inflamed with the rise of socialism, muckrakers counted on publicity to right social wrongs rather than revolutionary violence. They didn't seek to overthrow capitalism, just to improve it, to reform it. The cure for ills of American democracy wasn't strong-handed government. It was more democracy and populist action. Before we move on, we need to mention a few other notable progressives. Jane Addams, for example, was one of the first generation of college-educated women. As a teacher and a volunteer, which was almost always the only permissible occupation for a young woman of the middle class, Addams developed Hull House in Chicago, which was important in establishing the settlement house movement that became the center of women's activism and social reform in the Progressive era. Hull House, like other settlement homes, aimed to teach English as well as provide social services to immigrants moving into a urban center. Addams also helped found the NAACP and became a notable pacifist as World War I was on the horizon. For her work, Jane Addams received the Nobel Peace Prize. To Addams' right is Florence Kelley, who investigated and reported on child labor while living in Hull House. Kelley, also a lifelong battler of welfare for women, blacks, and consumers, was hired as the general secretary of the National Consumers League, which organized boycotts of goods manufacturers that used and exploited children as workers, had unsanitary working conditions, or sold adulterated medication. Upton Sinclair, the famed novelist who wrote The Jungle, will be spoke about later. To the bottom, Charlotte Perkins Gilman was the first female rights activist to coin the term feminism. Richard Ely, who we've already spoken about, developed the notion of the social gospel, along with Lester Frank Ward, changed the people's opinions about why people faced poverty and what responsibility Americans had to address the needs of their less fortunate brothers. While there is a wide range of objectives, especially within the social objectives of the progressive era, progressives in general sought to modernize American institutions and to achieve two important goals. Number one, to use the government to curb the excesses of monopoly and power. And number two, to use the government to improve the common person's conditions of life and at their workplace. In the next lecture, we will be talking about the two other areas of progressive reform, political and economic reform. These are handled separately because they tend to be a bit more complex and less well known than the social reform of the progressive era.